The red taillights vanished around the bend, leaving Maggie alone in the sudden silence that followed violence. Her hands trembled against the wheels of her chair, not from fear, but from the electric shock of hearing that name, Nightingale, a designation buried so deep in classified files that even thinking it should have triggered alarms in facilities that didn't exist on any government map. She forced herself to breathe, to count backwards from 10 the way Dr. Reeves had taught her during those endless therapy sessions after the accident. The technique was supposed to ground her in the present, to prevent the panic attacks that came with the memory gaps. But tonight, instead of calming her racing heart, each number seemed to unlock something darker. The parking lot lights flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows across the asphalt where her attackers had been sprawled moments before. They were gone now, vanished as completely as the bikers, leaving only scattered cigarette butts and the metallic taste of adrenaline in the air. Maggie wheeled herself closer to where the leader had stood, searching for something, anything that might prove she hadn't imagined the entire encounter. A single drop of motor oil stained the concrete. Real, tangible. Evidence that the Devil's Covenant wasn't just another fragment of her damaged mind. The drive home through Cedar Falls' empty streets took on a surreal quality, as if she were moving through someone else's memory. 3 years in this mountain town had created a comfortable routine, library work during the day, quiet evenings reading by the fireplace, weekend trips to Denver for medical appointments. A predictable existence designed to keep her stable, according to the doctors who'd overseen her recovery. Recovery from what exactly? The official story was a car accident on a mountain highway, black ice, a guardrail that didn't hold, and 3 weeks in a medically induced coma that had conveniently erased the months leading up to the crash. But car accidents didn't explain why she sometimes woke up speaking languages she didn't remember learning, or why her muscle memory could field strip a Glock in under 30 seconds, despite having no recollection of weapons training. Her house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-bedroom with wheelchair ramps that looked professionally installed, but too precise for standard medical equipment. Another detail she'd never questioned until tonight. The garage door responded to a remote that felt familiar in ways that made her skin crawl, and as she transferred from her car to the chair, Maggie caught herself scanning the tree line with tactical awareness that shouldn't exist in a small-town librarian. Inside, she went through the motions of normalcy. Groceries put away, kettle on the stove, evening news playing softly in the background. But her eyes kept drifting to the living room mirror, studying her reflection for signs of the person she used to be. Shoulder-length black hair, dark eyes that seemed older than 34, a thin scar along her jawline that the doctors said came from the accident. Everything perfectly ordinary, except for the way she automatically positioned herself to maintain sight lines to all exits. The kettle's whistle made her jump, a reaction that would have been embarrassing if anyone else had been watching. But as she poured hot water over chamomile tea, muscle memory guided her hand to a cabinet she rarely opened, reaching for a bottle hidden behind the flour container. The label read prescription sleep aid, but the pills inside were unmarked, chalky white tablets that dissolved under her tongue with clinical efficiency. She'd been taking them for 3 years without question, trusting Dr. Reeves' explanation about managing sleep disorders common in trauma patients. But tonight, with the taste of recognition still sharp in her memory, Maggie found herself hesitating. What if the pills weren't helping her sleep? What if they were helping her forget? The computer in her study hummed to life with a few keystrokes, the screen casting blue light across walls lined with books she'd collected since moving to Cedar Falls. Normal books, safe books, nothing about military intelligence or covert operations, though her fingers seemed to know exactly where to find references to classified programs that should have been beyond a librarian's clearance level. She typed Devil's Covenant Motorcycle Club into the search engine, then deleted it. Tried Cedar Falls security incidents and found nothing recent. Finally, almost against her will, she entered Operation Nightingale and watched the cursor blink in the empty search field like a dare. No results found, not even buried in the deep web searches that came naturally to her despite having no memory of learning those skills. Whatever Nightingale had been, someone had scrubbed it from digital existence with the thoroughness of professionals who understood that information was the most dangerous weapon of all. The sleep aid bottle sat on her desk, pills rattling softly as her hand shook. 3 years of carefully constructed peace hung in the balance, and Maggie realized she was standing at a crossroads that might lead back to a version of herself she wasn't sure she wanted to remember. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of motorcycle engines, and she wondered if tomorrow would bring answers, or if some secrets were buried too deep to ever see daylight again. The pills went down the kitchen sink. Maggie watched the white tablets dissolve in the running water, 3 years of chemically enforced sleep swirling down the drain. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bottle, reading the prescription label that bore Dr. Reeves's familiar signature. The expiration date was still 6 months out. He'd been planning to keep her medicated for a long time. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams instead of the usual black void. Fragments of desert landscapes, the weight of tactical gear, voices speaking in urgent whispers about extraction protocols. She woke at 4:47 a.m. with the taste of sand in her mouth and perfect recall of how to call in an airstrike using hand signals. The Cedar Falls Public Library opened at 9, which gave her 4 hours to pretend everything was normal. She went through her morning routine with mechanical precision, coffee made exactly the way she'd learned during those first confused weeks after the accident. Breakfast eaten, while scanning news websites with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to identify patterns in information flow. Another skill that had no place in a librarian's repertoire. By 8:30, she was wheeling herself through the library's back entrance, past the employee parking spots that never quite filled. Cedar Falls supported its library, the way small mountain towns supported most civic institutions, with polite indifference and budget meetings that treated books like luxury items. "Morning, Maggie." Janet Holbrook looked up from the circulation desk, her reading glasses perched on graying curls. At 62, Janet had been running the library's day-to-day operations since before the internet existed, and she treated Maggie's position as head librarian with the patient tolerance usually reserved for well-meaning but temporary inconveniences. "Any problems yesterday?" Maggie asked, settling behind the reference desk that had been lowered to accommodate her chair. The modification was another detail that seemed too professional, too permanent for someone who'd supposedly moved to Cedar Falls for temporary recovery. "Mrs. Patterson's grandson was here after school. Sweet boy, but he keeps asking about military history books we don't have." Janet's expression suggested this was a personal failing. "I told him to try the Denver Public Library, but you know how it is with teenagers and travel." The reference request should have been routine. Cedar Falls High School assigned research projects that sent students looking for resources their small library couldn't provide. But when 16-year-old Tyler Patterson wheeled himself through the door at 3:15, Maggie felt recognition snap through her nervous system like static electricity. "Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Holbrook said you might be able to help me find information about military intelligence operations." Tyler's wheelchair was state-of-the-art, the kind issued to veterans with specific mobility requirements. His posture was too straight, his eye contact too direct for a typical teenager. "That's pretty specialized. What's the assignment?" "World War II codebreakers. But I'm really interested in how intelligence gathering evolved into modern covert operations." Tyler's smile was practiced, designed to seem harmless. "My grandfather served in Korea, so I've always been curious about that stuff." The lie felt familiar, like an echo of conversations she couldn't quite remember. Maggie pulled up the library's catalogue, aware that Tyler was watching her fingers move across the keyboard with professional interest. "We don't have much beyond general military history. You'd need access to declassified documents, academic journals with security clearance requirements." She paused, studying his face. "Why the specific interest in intelligence work?" "Just seems like important history to understand. The stuff that doesn't make it into regular textbooks." Tyler leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? Do you ever feel like you know things you shouldn't know? Like information just appears in your head without any memory of learning it?" The question hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, the library faded around them, replaced by briefing rooms and tactical displays that existed only in the gaps between her memories. When reality reasserted itself, Tyler was gone, leaving only the faint scent of motor oil and the feeling that her carefully constructed ordinary world was developing cracks too wide to ignore. At 5:30, she locked the library's front door and sat in the empty parking lot, watching traffic thin as Cedar Falls settled into evening routines. Families heading home to dinner, shop owners closing up, the predictable rhythm of a small town that had embraced her as just another resident, seeking mountain air and quiet healing. But healing from what? And why did a 16-year-old research request feel like a reconnaissance mission? Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Reeves. "Missed check-in today. Everything okay? Remember, consistency is key to maintaining progress." She deleted the message without responding, then started her car and drove home through streets that suddenly felt like a maze designed by someone who understood exactly how to keep a person contained without making them feel trapped. The house waited at the end of Maple Street, windows dark, ramps precisely angled, every detail crafted to support a life she was beginning to suspect had been built on carefully constructed lies. The front door stood slightly ajar. Maggie killed the engine and sat in her driveway, studying the 3-inch gap of darkness between the door and frame. She'd locked it this morning. Muscle memory from a life she couldn't remember had made her obsessively careful about security details that shouldn't matter to a small-town librarian. The wind could have blown it open, but the deadbolt was engaged, visible even from this distance, as a steel tongue extending into empty air where the strike plate should have caught it. Someone had forced the lock with surgical precision. Her phone buzzed again. Dr. Reeves, probably, wondering why she'd missed their scheduled check-in, but when she glanced at the screen, the number was blocked, and the message contained only an address, 1247 Canyon Ridge Road, followed by a timestamp, 11:47 p.m., nearly 4 hours from now. A second text arrived before she could process the first. "Come alone. Bring questions about Nightingale. Leave the phone." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the car's center console. Canyon Ridge Road wound into the mountains above Cedar Falls, a serpentine stretch of asphalt that dead-ended at an abandoned mining operation. She'd driven past the turnoff dozens of times during her 3 years here, never once curious about what lay beyond the tree line. But now she could picture it perfectly. A gravel parking area surrounded by rusted equipment, a trailer that served as a site office, and clear sight lines in all directions, the kind of location someone would choose for a meeting they couldn't afford to have intercepted. The knowledge arrived fully formed, without context or explanation, like all the other fragments that had been surfacing since last night's encounter. Tyler Patterson's question echoed in her mind. "Do you ever feel like you know things you shouldn't know?" The answer was becoming impossible to ignore. She transferred to her wheelchair and approached the house with the systematic caution of someone trained to clear hostile territory. The porch light was motion-activated, designed to eliminate shadows where threats could hide, another detail that felt less like accommodation and more like preparation. Inside, everything appeared exactly as she'd left it. Coffee cup in the sink, morning newspaper folded on the kitchen table, the sleep aid bottle still sitting empty beside the drain. But the air felt different, disturbed, like the aftermath of careful movement through space. Her study door was closed. She never closed it. The wheelchair moved silently across hardwood floors that had been chosen for tactical advantage rather than aesthetic appeal. Through the partially open door, she could see her computer screen glowing, displaying a document she hadn't opened. Personnel file, classified Chen Margaret L., service number 847,291. Project designation, Nightingale. Status, terminated. medical discharge. Below the header, a photograph showed her in military dress uniform, ribbons across her chest that meant nothing to her conscious mind, but everything to the muscle memory that straightened her spine automatically. The face was younger, harder, eyes focused on something beyond the camera's range. The document scrolled as she watched, revealing service records that should have been destroyed, commendations for operations that didn't exist in official histories, and medical notes detailing a psychological conditioning program designed to compartmentalize traumatic memories. Subject demonstrates exceptional aptitude for intelligence analysis and field operations. Recommend continuation of Project Nightingale despite psychological risks. Memory suppression protocols effective at maintaining operational security. Final entry. Subject suffered critical injuries during extraction from Operation Snowfall. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol 7. Complete identity reconstruction with continuous monitoring. Protocol 7. The words triggered a cascade of images, a laboratory lined with medical equipment, electrodes attached to her temples. Dr. Reeves' voice explaining that the treatments were necessary for her recovery. 3 years of carefully scheduled appointments, prescribed medications, and psychological evaluations designed to keep her stable, designed to keep her controlled. The computer screen went black, replaced by a cursor blinking in an empty command prompt. Someone had remote access to her system, feeding her information in carefully measured doses. They wanted her to remember, but only specific pieces, only enough to bring her to Canyon Ridge Road with questions they were prepared to answer. Her phone rang from the kitchen, the sound sharp in the evening quiet. When she answered, Tyler Patterson's voice carried none of the practiced innocence from this afternoon. "Mrs. Chen, you need to leave Cedar Falls tonight. They know you're remembering. Who is this really?" Someone who used to work with Nightingale operatives before the program was shut down, before they decided you knew too much to live. Tyler's voice was older now, professional. "The Devil's Covenant saved you once. They won't be able to do it again. The meeting tonight is a trap. But it's also your only chance to get answers before they activate the failsafe." The line crackled with static. "Dr. Reeves isn't scheduled to return from Denver until tomorrow morning. That gives you maybe 10 hours before they realize you've stopped taking the memory suppressants." The call ended, leaving her alone with a choice that would determine whether Margaret Chen continued to exist or whether someone else entirely walked out of the mountains above Cedar Falls. Maggie set the phone down with trembling fingers and stared at the blank screen where her classified file had disappeared. 10 hours. The number felt both infinite and impossibly brief, enough time to drive to the next state, or barely enough to gather the courage to face whatever waited at Canyon Ridge Road. She wheeled herself to the bedroom window, where her go-bag sat in the closet behind winter coats she'd never needed in Cedar Falls' mild climate. The bag's existence should have surprised her, but pulling it out felt as natural as breathing. Cash in unmarked bills, fake identification documents, emergency supplies arranged with military precision. Another piece of the puzzle that painted Margaret Chen as an elaborate fiction. The identification showed her face with different hair, different clothes, but the same scar along her jawline. Sarah Mackenzie, the driver's license read. Valid until 2019, expired now, but expertly crafted. She had no memory of creating this identity, which meant someone else had prepared it for her, someone who'd anticipated she might need to disappear. "They know you're remembering." Tyler's warning replayed in her mind as she inventoried the bag's contents. If the Devil's Covenant had saved her once, it meant the danger was real. But if tonight's meeting was a trap, then the people orchestrating her recovery, Dr. Reeves, the mysterious handlers monitoring her system, were also the ones who wanted her dead. The logical choice was to run, load the car, drive through the night, disappear into the vast anonymity of interstate highway systems and major cities where surveillance became exponentially harder. She had the tools, the cash, apparently even the training necessary for that kind of vanishing act. But running meant accepting that Margaret Chen would cease to exist, replaced by another carefully constructed identity that could dissolve just as easily. It meant living forever as a ghost of herself, checking shadows and jumping at unexpected phone calls, never knowing if the life she built was real or another layer of manipulation. The alternative terrified her more. Canyon Ridge Road represented answers, but answers came with consequences. If she drove up that mountain tonight, she'd be choosing to reclaim whatever version of herself had been dangerous, enough to require 3 years of chemical suppression. The woman in that military photograph had earned ribbons for operations too classified to officially exist. She'd been important enough to condition rather than simply eliminate. That woman had also suffered critical injuries during something called Operation Snowfall, which suggested her previous life hadn't ended well. Maggie returned to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at the neat shelves of ordinary groceries that belonged to a life she was beginning to understand had never been hers. Milk that expired next Tuesday, leftover pasta from Sunday's meal prep, diet sodas and yogurt containers that painted the picture of someone focused on small, manageable routines. Someone healing from trauma. Someone being kept docile. The pills had stopped this morning, but their absence felt like stepping off a cliff in slow motion. Each hour brought new fragments, tactical formations, extraction protocols, the weight of body armor, and the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through desert air. Pieces of competence and violence that belonged to someone she'd forgotten how to be. Dr. Reeves' business card sat magnetized to the refrigerator door, his direct number written in the careful script of someone who took notes during their sessions. Call any time if you experience unusual memories or psychological distress. The offer had always seemed generous, but now it read like surveillance instructions. How many times had she called that number over the past 3 years? How many fragments of returning memory had she dutifully reported, thinking she was seeking help for trauma-induced confusion? Each call would have triggered adjustments to her medication, refinements to the conditioning that kept her contained. She dialed his number. Maggie? Dr. Reeves's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing crisis calls. I was concerned when you missed our check-in today. How are you feeling? Different. I stopped taking the sleep medication. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for him to check whatever monitoring system tracked her status. That's not advisable without medical supervision. Sleep disorders in trauma patients can trigger psychotic episodes, false memory construction. What's Operation Nightingale? The silence stretched until she could hear her own heartbeat. When Dr. Reeves spoke again, his voice had lost its therapeutic warmth. Maggie, I need you to take your evening medication and stay exactly where you are. Don't answer the door for anyone except me. I'm driving back from Denver tonight. The call ended. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees that surrounded her carefully chosen house at the end of Maple Street. Somewhere in those mountains, the Devil's Covenant waited with answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Behind her, the road back to Denver carried people who'd spent 3 years reshaping her into someone safe and manageable. Neither option offered the comfort of certainty, but sitting between them had become impossible. The go-bag waited by the door, and Canyon Ridge Road stretched into darkness above the town that had never really been her home. Maggie's hand shook as she zipped the go-bag closed. The simple motion felt like signing a death warrant, either for the woman she'd been for 3 years or for whoever she was about to become. The kitchen clock read 8:23 p.m., its digital display marking time until a meeting that would either provide answers or eliminate her entirely. She transferred the bag to her lap and wheeled toward the garage, muscle memory guiding her through a routine that felt rehearsed despite her conscious mind having no recollection of emergency protocols. The car's hand controls had been professionally installed, another accommodation that now seemed less like medical necessity and more like operational preparation. The garage door opened with mechanical precision, revealing Maple Street bathed in amber streetlight. Cedar Falls looked exactly as it had for 3 years, quiet houses with warm windows, the kind of small-town security that attracted people seeking refuge from complicated lives. But now she could see the strategic elements her trained eye had been conditioned to ignore: clear sight lines, limited escape routes, the perfect isolation of a place designed to contain rather than comfort. As she backed out of the driveway, headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. A sedan, dark blue or black, maintaining exactly the distance necessary for surveillance without appearing obvious. Dr. Reeves couldn't have driven back from Denver this quickly, which meant other players had been positioned closer than she'd realized. Canyon Ridge Road was 12 minutes away if she drove directly through town, but directness would lead the surveillance team straight to whatever waited in the mountains, potentially compromising the Devil's Covenant or turning their meeting into the ambush Tyler had warned about. Instead, she turned east toward the highway, watching the sedan follow at professional intervals. 3 years of careful conditioning hadn't eliminated her tactical instincts. They'd simply buried them beneath layers of pharmaceutical fog and manufactured routine. Now, with each mile, those instincts surfaced like air bubbles rising through water. The highway offered multiple exit options: truck stops with 18-wheelers that could provide visual cover, and the kind of traffic density that made surveillance exponentially more difficult. She accelerated past the speed limit, not enough to attract police attention, but sufficient to test her followers' commitment to remaining invisible. The sedan matched her pace exactly. At the Pine Grove truck stop, she pulled between 2 cargo haulers and waited. Through her mirrors, she watched the sedan circle the parking area twice before positioning itself near the entrance with clear sight lines to her vehicle. Professional work, but not perfect. They expected her to behave like a frightened civilian rather than someone with operational training. The expectation was her advantage. She exited through the rear of the parking area, headlights dark, using the truck stop's loading bays to break visual contact. The sedan would realize she'd moved within minutes. But minutes were enough to reach the network of service roads that connected the mountain communities above Cedar Falls. Canyon Ridge Road appeared in her headlights at 11:38 p.m., 9 minutes before the appointed meeting time. The gravel turnoff climbed steeply through pine forest, her car's modified transmission handling the grade with mechanical reliability that suggested someone had prepared this vehicle for exactly this kind of terrain. The mining operation appeared as Tyler's false identity had suggested it would: abandoned equipment casting long shadows under a moon bright enough to eliminate the need for additional lighting. But her tactical awareness catalogued details that civilian observation would have missed: tire tracks too fresh for an abandoned site, the subtle displacement of gravel suggesting recent vehicle positioning, and the complete absence of wildlife sounds that indicated human presence in the surrounding forest. She parked 40 yards from the trailer that served as the site office and waited. The go-bag sat within reach, but weapons would be meaningless if the Devil's Covenant wanted her dead. They'd had 3 years to eliminate her if that had been their objective. At exactly 11:47 p.m., figures emerged from the tree line. 3 people in motorcycle leathers, moving with a coordinated precision she remembered from outside Brennan's general store. But seeing them clearly for the first time, without the adrenaline haze of unexpected confrontation, she recognized something that made her breath catch in her chest. They moved like her. Not like civilians playing soldier, not like weekend warriors with military fantasies, but with the unconscious efficiency of people trained in the same operational protocols that were reasserting themselves in her muscle memory. The woman who'd spoken to her outside the store approached with empty hands visible, her posture communicating readiness without threat. "Margaret Chen," she said, and the use of her real name felt like recognition rather than identification. "You came. I need to know what happened to me." "What happened was that you became too good at a job designed to be impossible." The woman's voice carried the weight of shared experience. "And when you discovered something you weren't supposed to discover, they decided to erase you rather than eliminate you." Behind them, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the mountain air. Multiple engines, coordinated arrival. the kind of tactical response that meant her surveillance team had been more sophisticated than she'd realized. The woman smiled grimly. "But first, they have to find you." The engines grew louder, their coordinated approach confirming Maggie's worst fears. The surveillance team hadn't been fooled by her evasion route. They'd been herding her exactly where they wanted her. The mining site's isolation, which had seemed like protection, now felt like a killing ground. "How many?" Maggie asked, her tactical instincts overriding 3 years of conditioning. 6 vehicles, approximately 20 personnel." The woman's response carried the clipped efficiency of battlefield communication. "Standard containment formation, but they're moving too aggressively for a capture operation." The implications hit Maggie like ice water. Dr. Reeves and his handlers had decided that controlled amnesia was no longer sufficient. Whatever she'd discovered during Operation Snowfall was dangerous enough to require permanent silence. "Can we get out?" "Not through conventional extraction." The woman gestured toward the tree line, where her companions had already begun positioning themselves with military precision. "But there's another option. Your muscle memory is returning faster than they anticipated. We can use that." She handed Maggie a tactical radio and what looked like a standard first aid kit. Inside, Maggie found items that belonged to a different life: infrared strobes, emergency beacon, and a sidearm that felt familiar despite her conscious mind having no memory of weapons training. "I don't remember how to use this." "Your hands do." The first vehicle crested the ridge, a black SUV moving without headlights, relying on night vision equipment that painted the Devil's Covenant as heat signatures rather than human targets. Behind it, additional vehicles spread across the access road, cutting off retreat routes with the methodical efficiency of people who'd planned this operation in detail. "They've been tracking us since you left town," the woman explained, her voice calm despite the approaching threat. "The surveillance wasn't about watching you, it was about locating us. You're the bait that brings Nightingale's surviving operatives out of hiding." "Surviving operatives?" Project Nightingale wasn't shut down because it failed. It was terminated because it succeeded too well. Operatives started questioning orders, investigating their own missions, discovering inconsistencies in official narratives. She checked her weapon with practiced efficiency. 14 members of your unit died in training accidents over the past 5 years. You and 3 others were selected for conditioning instead of elimination. The first SUV stopped 60 yards away, and figures in tactical gear began deploying with coordinated precision. Their movements showed professional training, but Maggie's returning instincts identified subtle flaws in their formation, gaps that could be exploited by someone who understood their doctrine. What did I discover that made me too dangerous? Operation Snowfall wasn't an intelligence mission. It was domestic surveillance, targeted against American citizens who posed no national security threat. The woman's voice carried bitter experience. "You documented evidence that Nightingale was being used to eliminate political dissidents, whistleblowers, journalists, anyone who threatened specific corporate interests with government connections." The tactical team advanced in textbook formation, but their approach revealed a critical assumption they expected: to face frightened fugitives rather than trained operatives. The Devil's Covenant used that assumption, moving through positions that civilian thinking would consider impossible. Maggie found herself calculating angles, cover points, and extraction routes with clarity that should have terrified her. Instead, the returning competence felt like recovering from a long illness. For 3 years, her mind had been clouded by chemicals and conditioning. Now, faced with immediate danger, the fog was burning away. The people hunting us, they're not government? Government contractors with plausible deniability. Private military corporations that handle operations too sensitive for official channels. The woman's radio crackled with position reports from her team. Dr. Reeves reports to Meridian Solutions, the same company that managed Project Nightingale's termination. Spotlights blazed to life, turning the mining site into a stage where shadows offered the only refuge. The tactical team's commander used a bullhorn, his voice echoing off the mountain walls. "Margaret Chen, you're surrounded." Exit your vehicle with hands visible. This is your only warning. Instead, Maggie found herself checking the weapon's action with movements that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Her wheelchair wasn't a limitation in this environment. The mining site's rough terrain would favor mobility over speed, tactics over raw athleticism. What's the extraction plan? There isn't one. The woman's smile carried dark humor. This is a test, if you're really recovering. If the woman who uncovered Operation Snowfall is still buried somewhere in that conditioned mind, then you'll find a way out. And if I'm not, then we all die here. And Meridian Solutions eliminates the last witnesses to their domestic operations. The tactical team began their final approach, confident in their numerical advantage and superior equipment. But they were hunting Margaret Chen, the damaged librarian who needed medical supervision and chemical control. They had no idea what happened when someone stopped being afraid and started remembering who they used to be. The weight of the weapon in Maggie's hands felt like shaking hands with an old friend she'd forgotten she missed. Her fingers found the safety mechanism without conscious direction, muscle memory asserting itself through 3 years of pharmaceutical suppression. The tactical team's spotlights created harsh contrasts across the mining site, but her eyes adjusted with the automatic efficiency of someone trained to operate in compromised visibility. "How long do we have?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. 2 minutes before they finished positioning, the woman, who still hadn't offered her name, spoke into her radio with coded brevity. "Phoenix and Reaper are flanking through Sector 7. Wraith has overwatch from the equipment yard." Phoenix, Reaper, Wraith. Call signs that belong to operational security protocols, not motorcycle club nicknames. The Devil's Covenant wasn't pretending to be military. They were military, or had been before their own encounters with Meridian Solutions termination procedures. Maggie studied the tactical team's formation through gaps in the abandoned mining equipment. 20 personnel spread across predetermined positions suggested they'd surveyed this site extensively, probably identifying it as a likely meeting location through surveillance she hadn't detected. But their positioning revealed a critical flaw. They expected targets who would panic under pressure. The commander, tall guy with the bullhorn, he's assuming we'll try to break through the weakest point in their perimeter. She indicated a gap between 2 vehicles where the terrain forced their line to stretch. "That's exactly where they want us to go." "Good. Your tactical assessment is returning faster than expected." The woman's approval carried the weight of professional recognition. "What do you see that they don't?" Maggie's awareness expanded beyond immediate threats to encompass the entire operational environment. The mining site's layout, which had seemed random in daylight, now revealed strategic possibilities that trained eyes would recognize. Abandoned equipment provided cover and concealment. Gravel piles offered elevated firing positions. The trailer office blocked sight lines that could be used for movement. But more importantly, the terrain itself offered advantages that wheelchair mobility could exploit. They're thinking about this as a standard containment operation. Flat ground, conventional movement patterns. She gestured toward a network of maintenance trenches that connected various areas of the site. They haven't considered that their target might use routes they can't follow. "Show me." Instead of explaining, Maggie moved. Her wheelchair navigated the rough terrain with surprising capability, another modification that had been disguised as medical accommodation but clearly served operational purposes. The maintenance trenches were narrow enough to provide cover while allowing rapid movement between positions that would take the tactical team precious minutes to reach. The drainage system connects to the old mine shaft. If we can reach that, we have multiple exit points they can't predict or cover. Her voice carried the confident analysis of someone accustomed to solving tactical problems under pressure. But we'd need to neutralize their overwatch positions first. Already handled. The woman's radio crackled with confirmation codes. "Phoenix reports Sector 7 clear. Reaper has eyes on the command element." Through her peripheral vision, Maggie caught movement that shouldn't have been possible. One of the tactical team's rear guards simply disappeared. No gunshot, no struggle, just the efficient elimination of a threat by someone who understood stealth warfare better than corporate contractors expected. How long have you been watching me? 3 years, making sure the conditioning held, that you remained stable. The woman's honesty carried uncomfortable implications, but also waiting for signs that Margaret Chen was still recoverable beneath the pharmacological control. You've been manipulating me just like they have. Yes, but our manipulation was designed to preserve your life, while theirs was intended to erase your identity. The woman's radio squawked with urgent communication. Command element is moving. They're getting impatient. The tactical team's commander abandoned his bullhorn in favor of direct action. Hand signals coordinated a final approach that would squeeze the mining site from multiple directions, overwhelming any defensive positions through superior numbers and equipment. Professional work, executed by people trained in conventional military doctrine. But conventional doctrine assumed conventional opponents. Maggie found herself thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating probabilities and contingencies with the fluid precision of someone whose survival had once depended on exactly this kind of analysis. The pharmaceutical fog that had clouded her mind for years was burning away under immediate threat, revealing cognitive abilities that Dr. Reeves had worked systematically to suppress. I remember something, she said, surprised by the sudden clarity. Not Operation Snowfall, but before. Training exercises where we had to evade superior forces using unconventional tactics. What else? The weight of classified knowledge, knowing things that could destroy careers, end lives, topple governments. Her voice carried growing confidence, and the responsibility of deciding whether truth was worth the consequences. The tactical team reached their final positions, weapons trained on areas where normal targets would attempt to hide. But Maggie was no longer thinking like a victim seeking refuge. She was thinking like a predator who understood that sometimes the best defense was making your enemies afraid to continue hunting. Time to find out who I used to be. The words had barely left her lips when the first explosion shattered the mountain's silence. Not the controlled demolition of military ordnance, but the improvised chaos of mining equipment suddenly repurposed as weapons. Phoenix, whoever they were, had turned the site's abandoned fuel tanks into tactical advantages, creating distractions that sent the tactical team scrambling for cover while their carefully planned formation dissolved into reactive confusion. Move, the woman commanded, and Maggie found herself responding with automatic precision that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Her wheelchair navigated the maintenance trench with fluid efficiency, following a route that her rational mind insisted should be impossible, while her muscle memory treated it as routine. Behind them, tactical radios crackled with frustrated commands as Meridian's contractors discovered that their target assessment had been catastrophically inadequate. But movement through the drainage system revealed something that made Maggie's recovering awareness crystallize into sharp, terrible focus. She knew this place, not from her surveillance earlier that evening, but from years ago. Training exercises, operational planning. The mining site hadn't been chosen randomly. It was a contingency location she'd helped establish during Project Nightingale's active phase. I've been here before, she said, the realization carrying implications that made her hands shake, despite her returning tactical composure. This was one of our safe houses. Emergency cash point. The woman's confirmation felt like a door slamming shut on 3 years of carefully constructed lies. You helped design the defensive modifications, including wheelchair-accessible routes that hostile forces wouldn't anticipate or recognize. They reached the old mine shaft as automatic weapons fire erupted above them. The tactical team had discovered that their targets were no longer where conventional thinking suggested they should be, but their response demonstrated the fundamental limitation of corporate military contractors. They followed doctrine rather than adapting to evolving circumstances. Inside the mine entrance, emergency lighting activated automatically, revealing supplies that had been maintained and updated despite the site's abandoned appearance. Medical equipment, communications gear, weapons, and documentation sealed in waterproof containers. Everything necessary to sustain covert operations or provide resources for operatives who needed to disappear completely. "How many sites like this are there?" Maggie asked, though part of her already knew the answer. 17 active, 11 compromised. The woman accessed a secured communication system with credentials that suggested she possessed administrative authority over the entire network. Project Nightingale created the infrastructure for domestic operations that officially never existed. When they tried to shut us down, we used their own resources against them. And the other survivors? Phoenix is Maria Santos, explosive ordnance specialist. Reaper is James Washington, psychological operations. Wraith is David Kim, electronic warfare. Names that triggered fragmentary recognition, faces that might have been colleagues or might have been strangers, shaped by conditioning and memory suppression. You were our tactical analyst and operational coordinator. The pieces were assembling into a picture that Maggie's conscious mind wanted to reject, but her returning instincts recognized as truth. Project Nightingale hadn't been the counter-terrorism operation described in her fragmented memories. It had been domestic surveillance and elimination, targeted against American citizens whose only crime was threatening corporate interests with government protection. What did I discover that made them want to erase me specifically? Financial records proving that Meridian Solutions was being paid to eliminate targets selected by private clients rather than national security priorities. The woman's voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived with dangerous knowledge for years. Journalists investigating defense contractors, whistleblowers exposing corporate fraud, environmental activists threatening profitable development projects. We weren't serving national interests, we were functioning as a privatized assassination program. Above them, the sounds of combat indicated that Phoenix, Reaper, and Wraith were systematically dismantling the tactical team's operational capability. But Maggie understood that successful resistance here was only the beginning of a much larger problem. Meridian Solutions wouldn't accept the loss of their containment operation. They'd escalate until the threat was permanently eliminated. There's no going back to my life in Cedar Falls. Margaret Chen. The librarian never really existed. She was a constructed identity designed to keep you stable while the conditioning took permanent hold. The woman finally introduced herself with military directness. "I'm Colonel Sarah Mitchell. I was your commanding officer before Nightingale's termination. And now? Now we finish what you started when you began investigating Operation Snowfall." Mitchell activated equipment that began uploading data from the cache site to remote servers. "We expose Meridian Solutions' domestic operations and make sure that every Nightingale target they eliminated gets justice." The upload progress indicator showed 40% completion when the mine shaft's entrance exploded inward, revealing that the tactical team had regrouped with reinforcements and heavy equipment. Through the smoke and debris, figures in advanced tactical gear advanced with the methodical efficiency of people who'd learned from their initial mistakes. Maggie stared at the approaching threat and realized that everything she'd learned about herself, everything she'd recovered about her true identity, was about to be tested against odds designed to be insurmountable. The ordeal had truly begun. The advanced tactical gear told the story: night vision, body armor rated for military engagement, weapons that belonged in overseas operations rather than domestic law enforcement. This wasn't the same team that had approached with corporate contractor overconfidence. These were Meridian Solutions' primary assets, the operatives they deployed when plausible deniability became less important than absolute results. "Upload at 60%, Mitchell reported, her voice steady despite the approaching footsteps that echoed through the mine shaft with mechanical precision. "We need 3 more minutes." Maggie positioned her wheelchair behind a support beam that offered minimal cover against the firepower advancing toward them. Her recovered tactical awareness calculated angles assessed defensive positions, and reached the unavoidable conclusion that mathematics rarely lied about outcomes. 3 operators against 20-plus reinforced assault personnel in a confined space with limited escape routes. The first breach charges detonated deeper in the tunnel system, creating multiple entry points that eliminated any hope of controlling access. Phoenix's voice crackled through Mitchell's radio with professional calm that couldn't mask the deteriorating situation. Sector 7 is compromised. They've got heavy equipment cutting through our fallback positions. Reaper and Wraith? Static answered, followed by distant automatic weapons fire that spoke louder than words. Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since her accident, the particular clarity that came when survival depended on perfect decisions executed under impossible pressure. But that clarity also revealed how completely their situation had collapsed. The cache site that should have provided sanctuary had become a tomb, the operational advantages they'd possessed systematically, neutralized by an enemy that learned from mistakes. "The upload," she said, watching the progress indicator crawl toward 70%. "They're not here to capture us, they're here to destroy the evidence." 75%. Mitchell's fingers moved across equipment controls with the desperate efficiency of someone buying time with seconds. "If we can transmit the financial records, at least." The explosion that cut off her words came from the communications array. Somewhere in the tunnel system, shaped charges had eliminated their connection to the outside world, trapping the evidence they'd died to recover in an underground grave that would never be found. Maggie stared at the blank screen that had been their only hope of justice and felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with physical injury. 3 years of pharmaceutical suppression, followed by the gradual recovery of her true identity, followed by the discovery that Margaret Chen, the librarian, had never existed, all of it leading to this moment where the truth died with them. "The other sites," she said. "The evidence stored at the other cache points. Compromised. They've been systematically eliminating our entire network since your conditioning started failing." Mitchell's honesty carried the weight of absolute defeat. "We gambled everything on this location because it was our last functional repository." Through the smoke drifting from the destroyed communications equipment, tactical lights appeared like hostile stars. The assault team moved with overwhelming superiority, no longer concerned with stealth or preservation of evidence. Their orders had clearly evolved from containment to complete elimination. Maggie recognized the lead operator despite the tactical gear obscuring his features. Dr. Reeves, accompanied by a security detail that transformed him from manipulative psychiatrist to field commander, overseeing the final phase of Project Nightingale's termination. "Margaret." His voice carried through amplification equipment with false sympathy. "This doesn't have to end violently. You're experiencing severe psychological distress due to the artificial stimulation of suppressed memories. We can provide medical assistance." 3 years of lies," she called back, surprised by how steady her voice remained. 3 years of chemical conditioning while you eliminated everyone who knew the truth about Operation Snowfall. You were never well enough to understand the complexities of national security operations." Reeves stepped into visual range, flanked by operators whose weapons remained trained on their position. The conditioning was therapeutic, designed to provide psychological stability after your traumatic accident. "My accident that wasn't an accident. Your accident that resulted from paranoid delusions about domestic surveillance programs that never existed." His approach continued, methodical and patient. "These people have manipulated your damaged psyche, convinced you that therapeutic intervention was somehow sinister conspiracy." Maggie found herself laughing, actual laughter that felt like the first honest emotion she'd experienced in years. The absurdity of being gaslit by the architect of her conditioning, while armed operatives prepared to eliminate the last witnesses to a privatized assassination program. "Colonel Mitchell," she said quietly, "how long before they reach our position?" 30 seconds. "Any contingency plans for this scenario?" "Prayer, mostly." The tactical lights grew brighter as the assault team prepared for their final approach. Maggie closed her eyes and felt the weight of absolute failure settle over her like burial shroud. Everything they'd fought to expose would die with them, buried in a mountain grave that would never be found. She'd recovered her true identity just in time to watch it disappear forever. Then the mountain itself began to speak. Not metaphorically, the emergency communication system that Maggie had dismissed as destroyed suddenly crackled to life with a voice that made Dr. Reeves freeze mid-approach. Clear, professional, and transmitted on frequencies that bypassed conventional jamming. "This is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Domestic Counterterrorism Division, broadcasting on secured channels to all federal law enforcement agencies." Maggie's world tilted on its axis. Agent Sarah Chen, her sister who had supposedly died in a car accident 2 years ago. "I am transmitting from a hardened position with complete documentation of Meridian Solutions' domestic assassination program, including financial records, target lists, and operational protocols for Project Nightingale. This transmission is being recorded simultaneously by NSA monitoring stations, Defense Intelligence Agency oversight, and Congressional Intelligence Committees." The tactical lights wavered as Reeves' assault team received new orders through their communications equipment. Maggie could see the exact moment when their mission parameters shifted from elimination to damage control, their weapons lowering fractionally as the operational landscape changed beneath their feet. But the revelation that shattered everything wasn't the tactical situation. It was the memory cascade triggered by her sister's voice. Not fragmented pieces filtered through pharmaceutical suppression, but complete, crystalline recollection of who she had been and what she had discovered. Margaret Chen hadn't been a military intelligence officer. She had been FBI, working undercover within Project Nightingale to investigate domestic overreach by private military contractors. The wheelchair wasn't the result of an accident. It was the result of her cover being blown when she'd gotten too close to exposing Meridian's client list. And Sarah, brilliant, methodical Sarah, had spent 2 years infiltrating the oversight systems while everyone believed she was dead, building an airtight case that would survive legal challenge and political pressure. "Colonel Mitchell," Maggie said, her voice carrying a authority she'd forgotten she possessed. "These aren't my recovered memories. These are someone else's memories, implanted during the conditioning to create a false narrative I'd eventually accept as truth." "What do you mean?" "I'm not Margaret Chen, former military intelligence. I'm Margaret Chen, FBI special agent, and every memory of being a tactical analyst was surgically planted to hide my actual investigation. The pieces assembled with devastating clarity. They didn't just suppress my real memories. They gave me fake ones that would lead me toward Project Nightingale instead of their actual domestic program." Sarah's transmission continued with methodical precision. Subject Margaret Chen was targeted for elimination after discovering that Meridian Solutions was contracting with private clients to eliminate American citizens engaged in constitutionally protected activities. Her investigation revealed a network of corporate-sponsored assassinations disguised as national security operations. Dr. Reeves stepped backward, his confident authority crumbling as he realized the scope of their miscalculation. The conditioning held for 3 years. Her memories were completely suppressed. "Because you suppressed the wrong memories," Maggie said, understanding flooding through her with mathematical precision. "You found an FBI agent investigating corporate assassination, assumed she was military intelligence investigating Project Nightingale, and conditioned her based on incomplete intelligence. The absurd, terrifying truth, Meridian Solutions had spent 3 years conditioning her to forget an investigation that was broader and more damaging than anything they'd suspected. While they'd focused on containing Project Nightingale's exposure, she'd been documenting their entire domestic operation across multiple programs and client relationships. "Sarah," she called toward the communications equipment, "how much of my real investigation survived?" "All of it. Your field reports were automatically uploaded to secured FBI servers every 12 hours. When you disappeared, I continued your work from within their oversight systems." Her sister's voice carried professional satisfaction. "We have 3 years of additional evidence documenting their attempts to cover up the original crimes." Mitchell stared at Maggie with growing comprehension. "You're saying Meridian Solutions has been chasing shadows while the real investigation continued without their knowledge?" "I'm saying they created the perfect deep cover operation by accident. They thought they'd neutralized an intelligence threat, but they actually provided the ideal cover for a federal investigation they never suspected existed." Maggie felt something like joy breaking through the tactical situation. Every therapy session, every check-in, every moment they thought they were maintaining control, I was gathering evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. The assault team's weapons remained lowered as their command structure processed the implications of killing federal agents during a broadcast that was being recorded by multiple oversight agencies. Dr. Reeves spoke urgently into his radio, requesting guidance from supervisors who were probably calculating the political cost of their exposure. But Maggie's revelation went deeper than tactical advantage or legal protection. For 3 years, she'd believed herself to be a broken soldier recovering from traumatic injury. The discovery that she was actually an FBI agent who had successfully completed the most important investigation of her career, that Margaret Chen, the librarian, had been the perfect cover identity for someone who needed to disappear while federal systems built an airtight case, changed everything about who she was and what she'd accomplished. She hadn't lost her identity, she'd found it. The silence that followed her revelation stretched like a held breath. Maggie could feel the shift in power dynamics as tangibly as the mountain air, Dr. Reeves and his assault team frozen in tactical limbo, while their command structure recalculated the cost of their next move. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't calculating survival odds or escape routes. She was planning. "Sarah," she called toward the communications array, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd remembered exactly who she was. "What's our operational status?" "FBI tactical teams are approximately 12 minutes out. NSA has confirmed receipt of all transmitted data. Congressional oversight committees have been briefed and are demanding immediate answers from Meridian's board of directors." Her sister's voice carried professional satisfaction that made Maggie smile despite their precarious position. "Also, your friend Phoenix just uploaded terabytes of additional evidence from their mobile unit outside." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Your friend?" "Maria Santos, former Army EOD, current FBI technical specialist." The memories were flowing freely now, no longer filtered through pharmaceutical suppression or artificial conditioning. "She's been running parallel surveillance on Meridian's field operations while I gathered intelligence from within their therapy program." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his tactical gear looking increasingly ridiculous as his authority evaporated. "You can't possibly believe this psychological manipulation represents genuine recovery. The trauma you've experienced, the trauma of discovering that a private military contractor was being paid to assassinate American citizens." Maggie maneuvered her wheelchair toward him with deliberate precision, or the trauma of realizing that respected psychiatrists were willing to perform medical experimentation on federal agents to protect corporate clients. "Margaret, you're clearly experiencing severe dissociation." "Special Agent Chen," she corrected, her voice cutting through his condescension like surgical steel. "And the only thing I'm experiencing is the satisfaction of watching 3 years of meticulous investigative work finally pay off." The radio chatter from the assault team grew increasingly urgent as their supervisors struggled with an impossible situation. Kill federal agents during a live broadcast to multiple oversight agencies, or allow the complete exposure of a domestic assassination program that implicated dozens of corporate clients and government officials. Colonel Mitchell began gathering equipment with efficient movements. "What's our extraction plan?" We walk out the front door. Maggie felt the tactical situation crystallizing with beautiful simplicity. They can't eliminate us without confirming every accusation we've made, and they can't let us go without facing complete exposure. They're trapped by their own operational parameters. Sarah's voice crackled through the speakers again. "Margaret, I'm patching you through to Assistant Director Morrison." The voice that followed carried the weight of federal authority. "Special Agent Chen, this is Morrison. Outstanding work on Operation Snowfall. We've been building parallel cases against Meridian's corporate clients based on your intelligence, and we're ready to execute coordinated arrests. Sir, what about the assault team currently pointing weapons at us? Dr. Reeves and his personnel are now material witnesses in a federal investigation. Any attempt to leave the area or destroy evidence will result in additional conspiracy charges." Morrison's tone suggested he was enjoying this conversation. "We've also frozen all of Meridian Solutions' assets and issued warrants for their executive staff." Maggie watched Dr. Reeves' face cycle through emotions as he realized the scope of his organization's collapse. 3 years of careful conditioning, systematic elimination of witnesses, and corporate protected assassination, all unraveling because they'd misidentified a primary threat and created the perfect cover for the investigation that destroyed them. "Phoenix, Reaper, Wraith," she called through Mitchell's radio. "Operational status?" Maria Santos's voice answered with characteristic efficiency, secured the perimeter, and documented everything. "Also, the Devil's Covenant sends their regards. Turns out some of those bikers from Brennan's General Store work federal security in their day jobs." The laughter that escaped Maggie felt like the first genuine emotion she'd experienced since recovering her memories. The mysterious bikers who'd intervened during her encounter with local thugs hadn't been coincidence or chance. They'd been federal protective surveillance, maintaining distant watch over a deep cover operation they'd been ordered to monitor without interfering. "Colonel," she said to Mitchell, "I believe our regrouping phase is complete. New plan? We finish what we started." Maggie began moving toward the mineshaft exit, her wheelchair navigating the rough terrain with practiced ease. Every client who paid for assassinations, every official who provided government protection, every contractor who followed illegal orders. We build cases that survive political pressure and legal challenge. Dr. Reeves and his assault team parted before her advance, their weapons lowered and their authority evaporated. Behind them, the mountain cave that had been intended as her tomb became the birthplace of the largest domestic counterterrorism operation in FBI history. Margaret Chen, the librarian, had never existed, but Special Agent Chen was about to remind everyone exactly why some investigations are too important to stop. The emergence from the mineshaft felt like resurrection. Maggie guided her wheelchair through the narrow passage toward daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the artificial illumination of their underground confrontation. Behind her, Mitchell's tactical team maintained formation while Dr. Reeves and his compromised operatives followed in what could only be described as a perp walk, disguised as tactical withdrawal. The October air bit through her jacket with crystalline clarity, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter, but more importantly, it carried the sound of rotor blades. Multiple helicopters approaching from the valley below with the distinctive rhythm of federal response teams arriving in overwhelming numbers. "Phoenix," she called through her radio, "what's our welcoming committee looking like?" Maria Santos's voice crackled back with professional satisfaction. FBI hostage rescue team, ATF tactical support, and what appears to be half the Denver field office. Also, 3 news helicopters that somebody's going to have to deal with before this turns into a media circus. Maggie felt the weight of consequences settling over her like armor. For 3 years, she'd lived in the carefully constructed reality of Margaret Chen, the librarian, a wounded veteran rebuilding her life in a quiet mountain town. The revelation that this identity had been both cover story and prison was still processing through her consciousness. But the tactical implications were immediate and demanding. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the mountain pass. Black SUVs with federal plates, followed by local law enforcement that had clearly been briefed on the situation's complexity. Cedar Falls had probably never seen this level of federal presence, and the residents who'd grown accustomed to their quiet librarian were about to discover that their town had been the center of a domestic counterterrorism operation. Agent Chen, Assistant Director Morrison's voice came through her radio with crisp authority. We need you to walk us through the evidence cache before anyone else gets near it. Defense Intelligence is claiming operational jurisdiction, and we need FBI documentation to maintain control. The politics of interagency cooperation during high-profile investigations. Maggie had forgotten how much she'd missed the bureaucratic warfare that accompanied successful cases. Understood, sir. Colonel Mitchell has maintained chain of custody on all physical evidence, and I can provide detailed testimony regarding Meridian's operational procedures. She paused her wheelchair at a vantage point overlooking the valley, watching the federal convoy navigate the mountain roads with careful precision. Somewhere in those vehicles were agents she'd worked with before her deep cover assignment, supervisors who'd authorized 3 years of dangerous isolation, and prosecutors who would need her testimony to build cases against some of the most powerful private military contractors in the country. The consequences of her choices were crystallizing with mathematical precision. Exposing Meridian Solutions would save lives and restore constitutional protections, but it would also destroy the careers of everyone who'd provided them government cover. The corporate clients who'd paid for assassinations included business leaders, political figures, and foreign nationals, whose prosecution would create diplomatic complications lasting years. "Mitchell," she said quietly, "what happens to your team after this goes public? Depends on how much the Pentagon wants to pretend they didn't know what Meridian was actually doing." His tactical assessment carried no bitterness, just professional realism. Best case, we get reassigned to training positions and spend the rest of our careers explaining why we didn't report illegal orders. Worst case, courts-martial for everyone who followed operational directives we should have questioned. The weight of other people's lives in her hands. Every choice she'd made since recovering her memories had ripple effects extending far beyond her personal quest for justice. The federal agents approaching in the convoy below, the corporate executives who would face prosecution, the government officials whose careers would end in congressional hearings, all of them consequences of finishing what she'd started 3 years ago. Dr. Reeves emerged from the mine shaft, his tactical gear replaced by zip-tie restraints and the deflated posture of someone whose world had collapsed completely. As he passed her position, he made one final attempt at psychological manipulation. "You understand this destroys everyone who tried to help you recover? Your therapist in Cedar Falls, the medical staff who provided your care, the townspeople who believed your cover story, their lives become collateral damage in your investigation." Maggie met his gaze with steady calm. Their lives become evidence that federal agents sometimes need deep cover so complete that even they believe it's real. The lead FBI helicopter settled into the clearing below, disgorging tactical teams that moved with overwhelming professional competence. Sarah's voice came through her radio again. "Margaret, I'm in the command vehicle. Ready for debrief?" "Ready to finish this," she replied, beginning her descent toward the federal response teams that would transform 3 years of cover identity into the foundation for the largest domestic counterterrorism prosecution in Bureau history. Behind her, the mine that had been intended as her grave became the birthplace of the investigation that would redefine the boundaries between private security and government-sanctioned assassination. The final confrontation wasn't waiting in some distant future, it was beginning now, in courtrooms and congressional hearings, where the real battle for constitutional protection would be decided. The federal command vehicle hummed with controlled urgency. Banks of monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds, secure communication arrays connecting field operations to Washington decision-makers, and the distinctive tension of an investigation transitioning from covert to prosecutorial. Maggie transferred from her wheelchair to a reinforced seat facing Assistant Director Morrison, whose grey hair and weathered features spoke of decades managing cases that could reshape government policy. "Agent Chen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "we need to establish operational parameters before this becomes a media spectacle. Defense intelligence is claiming Meridian Solutions operated under classified contracts that supersede FBI jurisdiction. The challenge she'd been anticipating. Maggie felt her tactical instincts engaging with the clarity she'd missed for 3 years. "Sir, the evidence cache includes documentation proving Meridian accepted private contracts targeting American citizens engaged in constitutionally protected activities. Whatever classified authorization they possessed doesn't extend to corporate assassination services." Sarah leaned forward from her position at the communications console, her analyst's precision cutting through political complications. "Margaret, we have financial records showing payments from 37 corporate clients over the past 4 years. The targets included environmental activists, investigative journalists, union organizers, and federal whistleblowers." Morrison's expression darkened as he processed the implications. How extensive was their domestic operation? Comprehensive enough to require systematic elimination of federal oversight. Maggie felt the weight of her investigation crystallizing into prosecutorial strategy. They weren't just conducting illegal assassinations, they were targeting anyone capable of exposing their network, including the FBI agents investigating them. The monitors around them displayed incoming intelligence from coordinated raids across multiple states. Meridian Solutions corporate headquarters, private training facilities, and client meeting locations were being secured simultaneously as federal teams gathered evidence that would support prosecutions extending far beyond simple conspiracy charges. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled through the communications array from his position coordinating tactical assets. "Command, we have confirmation of evidence destruction at 3 secondary locations. Meridian's people are trying to eliminate their operational records." "Expected," Morrison replied. "How much damage?" "Minimal." Phoenix's technical team downloaded their complete database before they realized the scope of federal penetration. Mitchell's professional satisfaction was audible even through encrypted radio. They were so focused on maintaining psychological conditioning that they never suspected their entire network was being documented. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the tactical situation expanding beyond immediate law enforcement into constitutional precedent. The evidence they'd gathered wouldn't just destroy Meridian Solutions. It would establish legal boundaries defining when private military contractors crossed the line from security services to domestic terrorism. Congressional hearings would follow, Supreme Court challenges, and political consequences that would reshape the relationship between corporate power and federal authority. "Agent Chen," Morrison continued, his tone shifting to operational urgency, "we need your assessment of how many targets are still at risk. Meridian's contracts included ongoing operations that won't simply terminate because we've exposed their network." The question that had been haunting her since recovering her memories. "Sir, their client list included individuals who paid premium rates for extended surveillance and elimination services. Some of those contracts specified triggers that would activate if Meridian's security was compromised." Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, cross-referencing known targets with current threat assessments. "Margaret, we have federal protection teams deploying to 43 potential victims, but there are probably others we haven't identified. How do we find them?" "We don't," Maggie replied, understanding the scope of their challenge with mathematical precision. "We make it irrelevant. Every Meridian contractor becomes a federal witness. Every corporate client faces conspiracy charges that make continuing their contracts impossible. Every government official who provided cover loses their security clearance and faces congressional investigation." Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing the strategy that had made her investigation successful despite 3 years of pharmaceutical suppression and psychological conditioning. Systematic dismantlement rather than reactive protection. "Exactly. We don't just stop their current operations. We make their business model unsustainable by destroying the political protection that allowed it to exist." She felt the clarity of purpose that had sustained her through years of dangerous isolation. Every contract they've fulfilled becomes evidence. Every client relationship becomes a prosecution target. Every government connection becomes a congressional hearing. The radio chatter intensified as field teams reported successful evidence seizures from locations across the country. Financial records, operational communications, client contracts, and witness testimony that would support prosecutions extending far beyond Meridian's direct employees to include the corporate executives and government officials who had made their domestic assassination program possible. But beneath the satisfaction of tactical success, Maggie felt the weight of personal transformation. Margaret Chen, the librarian, had been a cover identity so complete that even she had believed it was real. The 3 years of rehabilitation, therapy, and careful rebuilding of a disabled veteran's life, all of it had been simultaneously genuine recovery and perfect operational cover. Morrison's radio crackled with urgent priority traffic. "Sir, we have confirmation that Meridian's board of directors is requesting immediate diplomatic asylum. They're claiming their operations were conducted under foreign intelligence contracts." "Denied," Morrison replied without hesitation. "They want to run to countries that paid for their services. They can face extradition proceedings instead." Maggie felt the pieces of a 3-year investigation finally aligning into prosecutorial inevitability. The final test wasn't surviving their attempts at elimination. It was ensuring that justice extended beyond simple revenge to constitutional protection that would prevent future corporate assassination programs. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm ready to testify." Morrison leaned back in his command chair, studying Maggie with the calculating gaze of someone who'd built his career on high-stakes prosecutions. "Agent Chen, before we proceed with testimony preparation, there's something you need to know. Dr. Reeves isn't the operational head of Meridian Solutions. He's middle management. The real architects of this program are demanding to speak with you personally." The words hit Maggie like ice water. 3 years of careful investigation, systematic evidence gathering, and personal sacrifice, all building toward a confrontation she'd assumed was complete. Who? Director Catherine Blackwood, former NSA Deputy Director turned Meridian's Chief Executive. She claims you have something that belongs to her, and she's willing to trade the complete client database for a face-to-face meeting. Sarah's fingers froze over her keyboard. "Margaret, Blackwood was your original handler before the deep cover assignment. She's the one who authorized your memory suppression." The weight of betrayal settled over Maggie with crushing finality. The woman who'd sent her into 3 years of pharmaceutical imprisonment, who'd engineered her isolation and vulnerability, wanted to negotiate. "Where is she?" "Approaching the perimeter under federal escort," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the tension of someone managing an operation that could explode into political catastrophe. "She surrendered voluntarily, claiming diplomatic immunity and demanding immediate access to plea negotiations." Through the command vehicle's armored windows, Maggie could see a black sedan navigating the mountain road with the careful precision of someone arriving for the most important meeting of their life. Behind it, federal escort vehicles maintained tactical formation while news helicopters circled at enforced distances, their cameras documenting the conclusion of an investigation that would dominate headlines for months. "Agent Chen," Morrison continued, "you don't have to take this meeting. We have sufficient evidence to prosecute without her cooperation." But Maggie felt the pull of unfinished business with gravitational force. For 3 years, she'd lived with gaps in her memory, questions about her final mission, and the nagging certainty that her accident had been orchestrated by someone who understood her operational patterns with intimate precision. Catherine Blackwood represented the answers she'd been seeking since the first flashback outside Brennan's general store. "I'll take the meeting," she said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd already survived the worst possible betrayal. "But I want full recording, federal witnesses, and tactical support positioned within response distance." The sedan stopped in the clearing below, disgorging a woman whose silver hair and tailored business suit seemed grotesquely inappropriate for a mountain crime scene. Catherine Blackwood moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of intelligence professionals, her posture radiating authority even in federal custody. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled through the communications array. "Command. Subject is approaching the perimeter. She's carrying what appears to be a briefcase and requesting permission to enter the command vehicle." Morrison exchanged glances with Sarah before nodding to Maggie. "Your operation, Agent Chen. How do you want to handle this?" Maggie felt the tactical situation crystallizing around her with mathematical precision. This wasn't just about prosecuting corporate assassins, it was about confronting the architect of her 3-year imprisonment, the person who decided that Margaret Chen, the federal agent, was too dangerous to exist, and Margaret Chen, the librarian, was the perfect cover for an investigation she'd never been intended to survive. "Send her in," Maggie replied, her hands steady on her wheelchair controls. "But Mitchell's team maintains tactical overwatch, and Sarah documents everything for prosecution." The command vehicle's door opened with hydraulic precision, admitting October mountain air and the woman who'd orchestrated the most sophisticated deep cover operation in FBI history. Catherine Blackwood stepped inside with practiced composure, her grey eyes immediately focusing on Maggie with the intensity of someone studying a chess opponent. "Margaret," Blackwood said, her voice carrying the warmth of feigned maternal concern, "you look remarkably well for someone who was supposed to die 3 years ago." The words hung in the air between them like weapons. Maggie felt her pulse steady into combat rhythm as she faced the woman who'd transformed her into a weapon so effective she'd destroyed the organization that created her while believing she was living a civilian life in recovery. "Director Blackwood," she replied with ice-cold precision, "you have something you want to negotiate. I have questions that need answers. Let's finish what you started when you decided I was too dangerous to remember who I really am." The final confrontation wasn't happening in a mountain cave or tactical operation. It was occurring in a federal command vehicle where 2 intelligence professionals would determine whether justice meant prosecution or something far more personal. Catherine Blackwood settled into the chair across from Maggie, with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades controlling conversations that determined national security policy. Her briefcase clicked open with mechanical precision, revealing documents that made Sarah's breath catch audibly. "Complete client files," Blackwood said, her voice carrying the tone of someone offering a gift rather than evidence of systematic murder. "Financial records, operational communications, target assessments, and contract specifications for every domestic elimination meridian conducted over the past 4 years. Everything you need to prosecute corporate executives, government officials, and foreign nationals whose activities threatened American business interests." Maggie studied the documents without reaching for them, recognizing the psychological manipulation inherent in the presentation. "What's the cost, Catherine? You didn't surrender voluntarily to help federal prosecution. The cost is understanding." Blackwood's grey eyes never wavered from Maggie's face. "You've spent 3 years believing you were the victim of corporate assassination attempts, but you were never the target, Margaret. You were the weapon." The words hit Maggie like physical impact, but her tactical training kept her expression neutral. "Explain." Project Meridian began as a classified NSA operation designed to eliminate foreign threats operating within American borders. Corporate assassination was never the objective. It was the cover story that allowed us to target state-sponsored terrorists, foreign intelligence operatives, and international criminals who couldn't be prosecuted through conventional legal channels. Morrison leaned forward from his position at the communications console, his voice carrying prosecutorial skepticism. "Director Blackwood, our evidence indicates Meridian accepted contracts targeting American citizens engaged in protected political activities. Evidence you gathered through an investigation designed and implemented by the most effective deep cover operative in NSA history," Blackwood replied, her attention remaining fixed on Maggie. "Margaret, you weren't investigating Meridian despite your memory suppression. You were investigating it because of your conditioning. Every move you've made over the past 3 years followed operational parameters you helped design before your final mission. Maggie felt the foundations of her understanding shifting beneath her like unstable ground. The accident, the memory loss, the rehabilitation in Cedar Falls, carefully orchestrated to provide you with perfect cover for the most comprehensive counterintelligence operation in American history. Blackwood's voice carried pride rather than apology. We needed someone capable of dismantling a rogue intelligence network from the inside, but the targets included federal agents, defense contractors, and government officials who would recognize any conventional investigator. So we created Margaret Chen, the disabled librarian, a cover identity so complete that even you believed it was real. The tactical situation was reorganizing itself around Maggie with devastating clarity. 3 years of careful investigation, systematic evidence gathering, and personal sacrifice, all of it following patterns she'd established during operational planning sessions she couldn't remember. The Devil's Covenant bikers who'd protected her outside Brennan's General Store hadn't been rogue Meridian operatives. They'd been federal assets ensuring her investigation proceeded according to classified parameters. "The pharmaceutical conditioning," she said quietly, pieces of memory beginning to surface like fragments of a shattered mirror. "You didn't suppress my memories to protect Meridian. You suppressed them to protect the operation." "Exactly." Blackwood reached into her briefcase again, producing a medical file with Maggie's name and a classification level that made Morrison's eyes widen. Complete memory recovery would have compromised your cover identity and exposed you to elimination by the actual rogue network we were targeting. The memory suppression kept you safe while allowing your investigative instincts to function normally. Sarah's voice carried the strain of someone whose worldview was collapsing in real time. "Margaret, if this is true, then everyone who tried to kill you over the past 3 years weren't Meridian operatives following corporate contracts," Maggie finished, understanding flooding through her with crushing finality. They were members of an actual assassination network that Meridian was designed to infiltrate and destroy. Blackwood nodded with satisfaction. Foreign intelligence services, terrorist organizations, and criminal syndicates that had been using American soil as an operational base for years. Meridian Solutions was our Trojan horse, a apparently corrupt private military contractor that attracted their business while documenting their activities for federal prosecution. The weight of revelation settled over Maggie like a physical burden. Every choice she'd made since recovering partial memory had been guided by operational conditioning so sophisticated she'd never detected its influence. The investigation that had felt like personal redemption had actually been the completion of her original mission, executed with precision that demonstrated the effectiveness of deep cover protocols she couldn't consciously remember designing. "What's the sacrifice, Catherine?" Maggie asked, her voice steady despite the psychological upheaval. "What do you want in exchange for the truth?" Blackwood's expression shifted to something approaching maternal regret. "Your silence about Project Meridian's classified aspects. Full prosecution of the actual criminal network, but protection for the federal operation that made their exposure possible. Justice without constitutional crisis." Morrison's radio crackled with urgent priority traffic, but Maggie barely registered the tactical chatter. She was staring at the choice that would define not just her future, but the precedent for how American intelligence services balanced national security against constitutional protection. The cost of winning was becoming clear. Complete victory required sacrificing the truth that had driven her investigation for 3 years. Maggie stared at the documents spread across the command vehicle's tactical table, her mind processing the weight of 3 years' worth of carefully orchestrated deception. The silence stretched between her and Catherine Blackwood like a chasm filled with classified truths and constitutional implications that would reshape American intelligence operations for decades. "No," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd already survived the worst possible betrayal. "I won't be your weapon twice, Catherine." Blackwood's composed expression flickered with surprise. "Margaret, you don't understand the implications." "I understand perfectly." Maggie's hands remained steady on her wheelchair controls as she faced the woman who'd engineered her 3-year imprisonment in a false identity. "You want me to protect a classified program that used American citizens as unwitting assets, that conducted domestic operations without constitutional oversight, and that decided I was too dangerous to remember my own identity. That's not justice. That's institutional protection masquerading as national security." Morrison leaned forward from his position at the communications console, recognizing the prosecutorial opportunity that Blackwood's revelations had created. "Agent Chen, what are you proposing?" "Complete disclosure," Maggie replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd found clarity in the midst of operational chaos. "Federal prosecution of the actual criminal network, congressional investigation of Project Meridian's constitutional violations, and public accountability for intelligence operations that treat American citizens as expendable assets." Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, documenting every word of the conversation that would determine whether justice extended beyond simple prosecution to include constitutional protection. "Margaret, full disclosure means exposing classified methods that could compromise ongoing operations. Then those operations need congressional oversight rather than bureaucratic concealment," Maggie countered, understanding the scope of constitutional crisis that Blackwood's program represented. "We don't protect democracy by abandoning democratic principles, even when the threats are real." Blackwood's maternal demeanor vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of someone accustomed to making decisions that shaped national security policy. "You're being idealistic about threats you can't comprehend. The networks we've dismantled through Meridian saved thousands of American lives. By sacrificing constitutional protections that define what American lives are worth preserving," Maggie replied, feeling the weight of personal transformation that extended far beyond her own recovery. "You turned me into a weapon so effective I destroyed my own life while believing I was seeking justice. That's not operational success. That's institutional corruption disguised as patriotic duty." The radio chatter intensified as field teams across the country continued reporting successful evidence seizures, but Maggie barely registered the tactical updates. She was focused on the choice that would determine whether her investigation represented genuine accountability or simply replaced one form of classified manipulation with another. Morrison's voice carried the tension of someone managing a prosecution that could reshape federal law enforcement. "Director Blackwood, Agent Chen's position has significant constitutional merit. Domestic intelligence operations require oversight mechanisms that Project Meridian specifically circumvented. Oversight mechanisms that would have prevented us from stopping foreign assassination networks operating within American borders," Blackwood countered, her voice rising with frustration. "Margaret, you helped design these protocols because conventional legal channels weren't sufficient to address state-sponsored terrorism disguised as corporate activity. Then we strengthen legal channels rather than abandoning them," Maggie said quietly, remembering fragments of operational discussions that felt like echoes from another person's life. "Constitutional protection isn't a luxury we can suspend when threats become sophisticated. It's the foundation that makes protection meaningful." Through the command vehicle's armored windows, she could see federal agents continuing their systematic documentation of evidence that would support prosecutions extending far beyond Meridian's direct employees. The investigation that had begun with motorcycle riding protectors outside a Mountain General store was concluding with constitutional questions that would define American intelligence operations for generations. "Agent Chen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of prosecutorial responsibility, "your testimony will be the foundation for congressional hearings that could reshape federal law enforcement. Are you prepared for that level of public scrutiny?" Maggie felt the clarity of purpose that had sustained her through 3 years of dangerous isolation, pharmaceutical suppression, and systematic psychological manipulation. Margaret Chen, the librarian, had been a cover identity so complete that even she had believed it was real. But Margaret Chen, the federal agent, had always understood that justice required accountability, even when accountability was personally devastating. "I'm prepared," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of constitutional crisis that her testimony would precipitate. "Project Meridian ends today. Complete federal prosecution, congressional investigation, and public accountability for intelligence operations that treat constitutional protection as operational convenience." Blackwood's expression shifted to something approaching genuine regret as she recognized the end of a classified program that had shaped her career for over a decade. "You're destroying everything we built to protect this country." "I'm protecting what makes this country worth defending," Maggie corrected, understanding finally that redemption required sacrificing the institutional protection that had made her investigation possible. The cost of complete victory was becoming clear. Constitutional justice demanded exposing the very system that had enabled her to seek justice in the first place. The silence that followed Maggie's declaration stretched across the command vehicle like the aftermath of controlled detonation. Catherine Blackwood closed her briefcase with mechanical precision, understanding that 3 years of carefully orchestrated protection had just been dismantled by the very operative it was designed to shield. "You realize," Blackwood said quietly, "that choosing constitutional principle over operational pragmatism means you'll never be able to return to intelligence work. No federal agency will trust an operative who prioritizes public accountability over classified protection." Maggie felt something shift inside her chest, not loss, but liberation. "I don't want to return to that world, Catherine." Margaret Chen, the federal agent, was willing to sacrifice her own identity for operational success. "I won't make that choice again." Through the command vehicle's windows, she could see Cedar Falls spread across the mountain valley below, the town where she'd spent 3 years believing she was recovering from random tragedy while actually executing the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation in federal history. The library where she'd found purpose in helping others discover truth through literature. The streets where neighbors had learned her name and offered genuine friendship rather than operational convenience. "Morrison," she said, turning to the federal prosecutor who'd spent 3 months helping her understand the scope of institutional betrayal she'd uncovered, "I want to return to Cedar Falls after the congressional testimony, permanently." Morrison's expression reflected understanding that extended beyond professional respect. "Agent Chen, you've just concluded the most successful domestic counterintelligence investigation in FBI history. The Bureau will offer positions that utilize your proven capabilities." "My proven capabilities include being manipulated so effectively I forgot my own identity," Maggie replied with quiet humor that surprised everyone in the vehicle. "I'd rather use my actual capabilities, helping people find information they need to make informed decisions about their lives." Sarah looked up from her documentation console, recognizing the transformation that extended far beyond tactical success. "Margaret, you're talking about returning to work as a librarian. After everything you've accomplished, I'm talking about returning to work that doesn't require lying to people I care about," Maggie corrected, understanding that the choice represented healing rather than retreat. "The library in Cedar Falls serves a community where people know me as someone who helps rather than someone who investigates. That's not a professional limitation, it's personal growth." Blackwood's voice carried genuine confusion. "Margaret, you're choosing provincial isolation over influence that could shape national security policy for decades. Your testimony will establish precedents, but your ongoing involvement could ensure those precedents are implemented effectively." "My ongoing involvement would mean accepting that intelligence work requires sacrificing personal relationships for operational necessity," Maggie replied, remembering the faces of Cedar Falls residents who'd offered friendship to Margaret Chen, the librarian, without knowing they were supporting Margaret Chen, the federal agent. "I've learned the difference between effectiveness and integrity, Catherine. They're not the same thing." The radio crackled with reports from field teams completing evidence seizures across 4 states, but Maggie barely registered the operational updates. She was focused on the choice between returning to institutional power that demanded constant deception or returning to community service that valued consistent honesty. Morrison's voice carried prosecutorial satisfaction. "Agent Chen, your investigation will result in over 200 federal indictments and congressional reforms that strengthen constitutional oversight of domestic intelligence operations. That represents genuine systemic change. Systemic change that I'll monitor from the library in Cedar Falls," Maggie said with certainty that felt like coming home after years of displacement. "Citizens need access to information about congressional hearings, federal prosecutions, and constitutional reforms. Librarians help people understand how democratic institutions actually function rather than how intelligence agencies claim they function." Through the command vehicle's communications system, she could hear federal agents coordinating the logistical requirements of the largest counterintelligence prosecution in American history. Evidence processing, witness protection, congressional liaison, and media coordination that would occupy federal prosecutors for years. But Maggie was thinking about the Cedar Falls Library's community room, where residents gathered for book discussions, voter information sessions, and town meetings, where neighbors addressed local concerns with directness that federal operations could never achieve. She was thinking about work that built community trust rather than exploiting community vulnerability. "Catherine," she said finally, facing the woman who'd engineered her 3-year transformation with mixture of anger and unexpected gratitude, "Project Meridian taught me that institutional protection ultimately protects institutions rather than people. I choose protecting people." Blackwood nodded with resignation that carried professional respect. Margaret Chen, the federal agent, would have made a different choice. Margaret Chen. "The federal agent no longer exists," Maggie replied, understanding that redemption meant choosing growth over power, community over control, and constitutional principle over operational convenience. The return to Cedar Falls wouldn't represent retreat from important work. It would represent advancement toward work that honored the constitutional principles her investigation had been designed to protect. 6 months later, Maggie rolled her wheelchair through the morning sunlight streaming across the Cedar Falls Library's hardwood floors, carrying coffee that Mrs. Patterson had brought from the bakery, along with her daily update about her grandson's deployment overseas. The familiar routine felt different now, not because the work had changed, but because Maggie finally understood the difference between helping people find truth and manipulating people to serve institutional objectives. The community room buzzed with quiet conversation as residents gathered for the monthly town meeting. Sarah Morrison sat near the back, her laptop documenting local concerns with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to federal evidence, though her smile held contentment that courtroom victories had never provided. She'd resigned from the bureau 3 months earlier, accepting Maggie's invitation to co-manage the library's new civic information program. Margaret, called Tom Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname that had initially confused Cedar Falls residents, from his position near the coffee station. "My daughter wants to research constitutional law for her college application essay, something about intelligence oversight reforms." Maggie suppressed a smile, remembering when constitutional oversight had been an operational obstacle rather than civic education. "Check the government documents section. We received new Congressional Research Service reports last week covering intelligence reform legislation." She'd testified before Congress 4 times over the past 6 months, her wheelchair positioned at witness tables where she'd explained how Project Meridian had circumvented constitutional protections while achieving legitimate counterintelligence objectives. The hearings had generated 17 new oversight requirements for domestic intelligence operations and resulted in the largest federal prosecution in American history. Catherine Blackwood was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation that had dismantled foreign assassination networks operating across 3 continents. But Maggie was prouder of helping Tom's daughter understand how democratic institutions actually functioned than she'd ever been, of manipulating those institutions to serve classified objectives. "Ms. Chen," said Ashley Martinez, a high school senior whose research project on government transparency had evolved into genuine civic engagement, "I found those documents about intelligence oversight, but I don't understand the legal terminology. Could you help me translate the bureaucratic language?" "Absolutely," Maggie replied, remembering when she'd written similar bureaucratic language designed to obscure rather than illuminate federal operations. Congressional oversight means elected representatives monitor intelligence activities to ensure they comply with constitutional protections. The new legislation requires regular reporting that citizens can access through Freedom of Information Act requests. Through the library's front windows, she could see motorcycles parked outside Brennan's general store, not the tactical precision of Devil's Covenant operatives, but weekend riders stopping for supplies before continuing through mountain passes that offered scenic recreation rather than operational concealment. The sight no longer triggered memories of classified missions or institutional betrayal, only appreciation for a community where people's identities matched their actual lives. Morrison approached from the circulation desk, holding a manila folder that contained correspondence from former federal colleagues who still couldn't understand why she'd chosen provincial library work over prosecutorial advancement. "Margaret, we received another letter from the Justice Department. They're offering consulting positions for the ongoing Meridian prosecutions." "Not interested," Maggie replied without hesitation, focused on Ashley's research questions rather than institutional opportunities that would require returning to a world where effectiveness demanded deception. "Our work here serves constitutional principles more directly than federal consulting." The afternoon brought familiar patterns that felt like genuine community rather than operational cover, helping elderly residents navigate Medicare documentation, teaching teenagers how to evaluate source credibility for school projects, coordinating with town council members about budget information that citizens needed to make informed voting decisions. As evening approached, Maggie remained at the circulation desk, organizing returned books while Sarah prepared the community room for tomorrow's voter information session. The work felt significant, not because it influenced national security policy, but because it strengthened democratic participation at the level where democracy actually functioned. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice carrying satisfaction that federal convictions had never provided, "Mrs. Patterson asked me to thank you for helping her understand the congressional hearing transcripts. She said reading your testimony helped her comprehend how intelligence agencies were supposed to serve citizens, rather than the other way around." Maggie felt the deep contentment of work that honored rather than exploited public trust. "That's what libraries are for, Sarah, helping people understand how democratic institutions actually work." Through the library's windows, Cedar Falls settled into evening routines that reflected genuine community rather than operational security. Neighbors whose friendship didn't serve classified objectives. Work that built rather than betrayed public trust. A life where personal identity matched public service. Margaret Chen. The federal agent had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed. Margaret Chen, the librarian, had found purpose that didn't require sacrificing constitutional principles for institutional protection. The transformation was complete. The new beginning had become simply beginning again every day, with work that honored the people she served.